that takes care of that, and now we get to start the show. Shorebikes Nation, without further ado, let's welcome the publisher of Battle Quest Comics. It's Andrew Kafoury. Hey, Andrew, how you doing? Andrew, how's
Well,
your
man,
day? Oh, I didn't mean to cut the applause so abruptly.
that was a big applause. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Andrew, I want to go ahead and say I was perusing the Battle Quest Comics Instagram page, and there was a post that made me really happy to see. I'm a big fan anytime that companies and publishers and etc. like are topical. They post other things other than what they're trying to sell. In your case, comic books. There was a post highlighting and celebrating the season finale of Severance season 2, which automatically made me a big fan, even bigger fan of Battle Quest comics. So I got to ask, who's in charge of the Battle Quest social media page? Go and give them a raise. And who's the Severance fan among the company?
Oh, that's me. That's
There
me.
we go. A
I
man
was
of good
watching.
taste.
Yeah, it's funny because I think like, how do you show sincerity as a comic book publisher, and do you want to push consumer attention to other places? But when it comes down to Severance, I think we can all agree that we should all join the conversation. So.
Oh, absolutely. It's a unanimous, everyone that's got fine taste or good taste in anything is a fan of Severance, is what I've noticed. And I mean, considering that you are a writer on a lot of titles from through Battle Quest comics, I am curious, and maybe I might be like reaching, or I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but as a writer yourself, do you appreciate the writing in the show as much as I think a writer would? Because that's one of my favorite aspects of the show, is that the writing feels smart without being like, I mean, it's kind of highbrow, but I don't know. There's something very natural to it in terms of in the context of the show.
Yeah, so from a writing standpoint, sometimes I look more at the internal journey of the character, right? You know what I mean? Those are kind of the patterns and the beats that I'm trained to pick up. But then I go on TikTok and I watch all the reels on it, and they talk about all the external things like the sheep on the side of the notepad.
Yeah.
And then I start realizing that there's like an entire side of Severance that I miss. And so I get to kind of watch the show for the story as I enjoy it, and then read all the theories, like the things the directors put in. And
Do you know how happy that makes me that a smart guy like yourself that writes professionally also goes on TikTok to look up the theories and all the other videos? I think it warms my heart that to know that everyone is so interested and invested in like the spin-off theories, and you can always pick something up.
I'm really into the theory. Then I didn't get this watching the show, but that the people, outside of Lumen are the sheep,
Oh,
and
I didn't
or
get
they're the
that either.
goats. The people outside of Lumen are the goats, and that the brother was a goat, or he's one of Lumen's four. There's the malice, the
Oh,
past figures or something. Yeah,
yeah. What did they call it? It skips my brain, but that's a really good theory. I've seen some pretty good ones. A lot of them revolving around cloning.
for cloning, right? Yeah, and maybe the whole town is actually sort of a big Lumen experiment. For me, when I watch the show and I think about the characters, it's like, well, so Mark is, he's seemingly the company man when you first
Hmm.
meet him, and then the more you learn about him, actually, he's really in conflict with himself, and he wants to connect and not be alone, and you know, as that connection is further taken from him by the rules of Lumen, he rebels,
Yeah.
and and then you kind of learn that about all four of the main characters, and then I was really flipped out when I found out that Helly was the lady on top, and she's actually like, she's the company woman on the top, but then inside, and so it makes me
Yeah,
wonder,
she's the rebel.
is Helly on top actually a rebel, and does that come out in her innate? Because she's the daughter of the guy, and they seem to have some friction between each other, like in the egg eating scene. So, but yeah,
which
I,
which to just like a regular Joe Schmo that's tuning in right now that hasn't watched Severance, the
oh
egg
no,
eating scene is such an interesting phrase, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's no spoilers. I will say, when the marching band showed up in the and I think that's one of the things I talked about in that post was the marching band in
Hmm.
the
Mr. Milkshake, yeah.
You know, most shows would have a gunfight. Most shows would have like a standoff at the edge of a cliff, even a Battle Quest comic, right? Like that's what we
Hmm.
would do. We would put the hero and the good guy at the edge
Yeah.
of a cliff. They'd have a battle, right? And so the fact that you could take that energy and put it into a marching band and make like, just the menace of Lumen and Milchik and all the things that have built up over 2 seasons. And when I saw that marching band come in, I was like, man, like of course it's a marching band. Of course Milchik is going to dance. And that's terrifying, like this is what gets in the way of like of Mark and Helly accomplishing their
Yeah.
goal is and I'm thinking that the company is using that marching band to distract them because
Hmm.
their end is near. You know what I mean? And yeah, it's cool
Yeah.
stuff.
Last thing I'll say about Severance, and thank you so much for indulging me in my Severance chat this early on in the podcast. But I was watching the after thing that they do every episode with the actors and the director and the writer. I I think the creator of the show or the writer of the show was talking about that marching band scene, and it was so refreshing to hear him say, we already did like a dance party in I think season one. So we were like, well, let's just like take it up a notch and bring on a full marching band. Like that idea was just a cool idea. Like obviously, I think there's a lot of like things that you can infer out of it and symbolism, but out of the writer or the creator's mouth was like it was just a cool idea. And I think there's something refreshing about a show that is so layered, so nuanced. That subverts a lot of expectations that some of it is just like, nah, it's just really cool. And I do agree. Like that marching band scene is like, it was awesome. So, but Drew, we are not here to talk about Severance as much as I would love to do a whole 2 hour episode with you about the season finale. I want to talk about Battle Quest Comics, which is why you're here. You're the publisher of said company. And I guess I want to start off with like maybe a rather, I don't know, difficult question might not be the word, but I want to get I guess I want to hear what's the temp check at Battle Quest Comics? Like, what's the vibe right now? In the intro, I said, and I think it's on your website too. You guys have been publishing comics for the last decade. In recent times, you guys just signed a new deal with Diamond Comics to distribute your comics on a larger scale. But I mean, just this year alone, we've had the headlines of, Diamond has declared bankruptcy, and then just last week, they were, or not even last week, I think just a couple days ago, they were bought out by what is it, Allegiance Entertainment or Alliance Entertainment, one of those names. But they just got bought out. It seems like every week something new is happening with Diamond. Now, Diamond isn't like the monopoly big, only game in town anymore. You've got now like Lunar Distribution and Penguin Random House. But I guess I say all that to say, what's the temp check for you guys at Battle Quest? Like, I'm assuming you guys are on your toes as well. I mean, what's the level of difficulty like navigating the industry, having just signed like this deal with Diamond and probably being super excited about distribution and things like that?
I think for us, we have had a lot of discussions about where the future is for the company, and they're all productive. Um, you know, I should say Diamond was terrific to Battle Quest Comics. Like they were really terrific to us, and it's I actually feel worse for the people there who might not have their jobs in less than a year than I do for anyone at Battle Quest, because we'll find a way. We're making pretty good comics. We've got a lot of other publishers that we're talking to about forming alliances. We've had offers to sub distribute other places. So Battle Quest is going to find a home one way or the other. But it definitely was like it was a it's it was interesting. It was interesting. Yeah, I would say like as far as the temperature check, we're okay. But it's been interesting to read for so many years about all the drama that goes on in the comic book industry, and then to actually be distributing at a time where there's so much change happening, and actually talking to a lot of the people involved and hearing a lot of things behind the scenes that led up to this, and also hearing what other people are doing and
Yeah.
getting a lot of firsthand experience, excuse me, a lot of firsthand information from, other publishers and marketing directors and editors at not just like, a lot of the independent companies, but the top five, right? Like, how is this impacting them and what decisions are they making? And how is
Yeah.
that going to how's that going to form or forge, the next 10, 15 years of what comic book distribution and comic book creation looks like.
Hmm. Yeah, and indie publishing has been on my mind a lot lately with the news of Diamond folding and things like that. And I think that was a big reason why I, jumped on the opportunity to, do this interview with you. Big shout out to Tyler for coordinating this. Was, just having indie publishers, you know, on my mind and thinking about like how they're having to navigate. I think about like Eli Schwab with Cosmic Lion Productions, and like he had just launched that as a publisher, and so like people like him are on my mind, and we're already talking about a very difficult industry to like break in and like be successful in, and then now you've got like the news of Diamond folding and all these uncertainties. So yeah, man, I mean, I know hopefully it doesn't sound like too much like a platitude, but I definitely am sending good vibes, your way, and I hope the next steps are, fruitful. But I guess I want to take a step back and say, you're the publisher of Battle Quest Comics. I can probably count on maybe one hand how many publishers I've had on the show, but I think it would be worthwhile to ask, what is the role of a publisher? Like how do you see your role at Battle Quest Comics? What does a publisher do?
Well, I'm the champion of all the projects that we create. I'm also the chief story officer of the company, which is maybe unusual. Well, I make sure that the comic books that are going out are on brand. Um, People who are doing, I am the person who makes sure that what you see is what the brand wants you to see, and I make sure that it gets where it needs to go on time.
Okay, so the mascot, the project manager, you're a man of many hats, is what it sounds like, and you write comic books too. You write like a few of the titles, right?
I wrote, well, so yeah, so Nomad the Unconquerable was a comic I wrote, and then it was recommended to me that, you know, maybe we should take the Nomad brand into something that was more of a home for fantasy adventure. So that's where Battle Quest came from. And then when Battle Quest was created, we populated it with the Trident of Aurelia, which is a mermaid action adventure about mermaids who battle sea dragons and crustacean abominations and gods and all these cool things. And then we did a Steel Siege, which is a mech war universe about it's a soldier and a diplomat who basically battle for peace on a war-torn world. So we had our three titles, and that gave us about 19 months of publishing, and we took that to Diamond, and Diamond put it into direct market distribution, and we used that cushion to build more titles, and that's what gave us the extension with Diamond to keep distributing. And then I think we have 7 flagship titles right now.
Yeah, and
So
I've got a few. I definitely want to talk more about the flagship titles and get your thoughts on those. Um,
can I
yeah,
pull back just for 1 second?
yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think that every comic book company does things a little bit differently. Most of the money that comes into comic book publishing usually comes from an outside source or it's crowdfunded. It's pretty rare that there's like a family, like, a family owned company like Battle Quest. It's not normal.
Now, when you
There are
say
fam sorry.
now when you say family owned, you've got family working on the company too, or
Well, I mean, we own Battle Quest.
okay, okay,
We don't have investor capital swimming through it. We're not managing someone's, stock portfolio and making sure that their brand is bringing in hot IP to keep them
got it.
right. Like, that's what a lot of most comic book companies that have been made, not all of them, but most of them that have come out in the last 10, 15 years come from the tech sector. There's somebody in the tech sector that raised a lot of money and they wanted to get into comic books. So they build a company, they populate it with 9 titles. They usually hire Garth Ennis or something, right, to come in.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
they launch with 9 core titles. And I think what we did at Battle Quest, which was different than that, is we put a specific emphasis into story. You know what I mean? Like, we were less
Hmm.
about building like IP and we were more about building story. And I think that's what helped Diamond really relate to us as a publisher, because Diamond is one of they really are like one of the last, if not the last, of the big companies that really believed in the ebb and flow of story in the market. Not everything in story for it to be successful is supposed to make $1 billion.
Yeah.
There's supposed to be a handful of things that make all the money, and there's supposed to be lots and lots, and that's supposed to make the room for all these new stories to be seen by people. And
Hmm.
Diamond understood that and believed in it. And I think, after 30 years, that, it's just unfortunate to see what's happened, because Diamond did a lot of good for a lot of people, and they did a lot of good for Battle Quest. And I'm certainly not saying anyone who hasn't been burned by the Diamond system doesn't have a grievance, but I think it's going to be unfortunate if we're in a world where every single story that gets out there has to be profit driven,
Hmm. That's
because
a good
that's going to
perspective.
all the stories are going to look identical to one another. Where's the
Yeah.
innovation supposed to come from, right?
Yeah. Everyone's.
How yeah.
Yeah, yeah. If
Sorry.
sales is the only, no, no, no. I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, you're right. If sales is the only objective, well, you kind of run into the same issue that I see of like the music industry and whatnot, where it's like everyone's kind of chasing the formula. Everyone's like kind of looking over each other's shoulders instead of focusing on like the story that they're trying to tell. Because it's like, well, the only thing that matters is sales. Fuck a story or integrity. What's everyone doing? What is everyone else doing? What's the formula? So that's refreshing to hear.
And you do want those sales. Don't get me wrong, you want those sales, but like, okay, let's say you open a bar, right? You open a restaurant. Every your first 5, 6 years, you're not going to be turning a profit at that restaurant, but you build a culture. You build a
Hmm.
culture in the restaurant, and that culture starts to be something you can monetize over time, right? And that's the same with story and story development. You build your stories to create a culture, and to build a foundation and grow your reader base and put yourself in a position to try to monetize that creativity. But if you just launch it with the idea that you're going to turn a big profit, then what are you here for, right? Like,
Hmm. Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like,
No, no, no.
how many comics did Stan Lee and Jack Kirby have to create for 50 years before they came around to Marvel Comics? I understand that that's an exaggeration, but
Hmm.
right, how many comics did they really make for decades before they finally got around to the Marvel universe? How long did they have to lay that foundation to put
Sure.
themselves in a position where they could just hit fire like that? Sorry.
No, I agree. Sales is obviously important, still business at the end of the day, but not at the cost of your vision, your passion, and like doing what you want to, what you set out to do. So that's great to hear that, that is a driving factor for you guys. Diamond aside, I was looking at the Battle Quest sampler that you guys handed out at the recent Comics Pro. I think last month or so. So I am curious, like, what has been the reception from what's been the reception from the industry at large and retailers and comic shops?
Well, we have, let's see, I think there's, as you know, there's about 2,500 stores in the US UK market. And I think Battle Quest at our peak was in about 492 of them.
Oh wow,
We've had a good reception. Of the 2,500 stores, around 500 of them will buy independent comic books.
that's
And
awesome. Yeah.
of those 500, a lot of them are dependent on those independent comic book sales to stay in business. And that's another thing with the Diamond thing that we're worth talking about. But Battle Quest has been well received by the comic book stores in the direct market, largely because of our emphasis on story, the kind of stories that we tell. I say that everybody who goes into a comic book store is looking for a little Battle Quest. Let's face it, right? Like, is that right? What are we doing, right? We're going and we're getting a cool little collectible picture book about heroes who go on journeys and have battles, and
Is that
that's
where the name came from?
heroes, journeys, and battles.
No, no, no. Battle Quest.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, so Battle Quest was um, it sounded cool.
Sometimes that's enough. Look, enough said. To bring up Stan Lee. Enough said. Sometimes just a cool title or a cool name does it.
Yeah, I feel like we tell stories about heroes who go on journeys and have battles. So it was like, let's just Battle Quest. And then it rang really true. I've had a lot of people who've been like, "Oh, Battle Quest, yeah, I've heard of you guys," and it's like, no, you haven't heard of us, but the name is so like familiar. It's like you
Hmm.
know what it means without the name itself is an archetype, right?
Yeah.
We know what the name means without being familiar with the brand. So
Damn, that's
and
interesting.
that's
Okay.
helped a lot.
All right, and Battle Quest, you guys are based out of Portland, and I want to hear Drew. And I want to hear Drew. What's the best way to describe the comic scene in Portland through your eyes? Because I know it as like one of the meccas of comic book activity. I mean, the amount of creators that live there is almost like too long to name. I mean, Brian Michael Bendis, Jeff Parker, the whole Helioscope Studio group is out of there. I think Rick Remender is from Portland or in Portland, Matt Fraction, etc. How would you describe the comic book scene for, especially for as an indie publisher and creator?
I think Portland's it's like a capital for comic book creators, largely because it rains here, so people can stay inside and work.
It's a good way to put it.
Yes, and then I
Huh.
think that, economically, like, it's affordable for comic book creators. Some of them make pretty good salaries, but, like, you living in Portland provides a high quality of life, and then for economically where they're at, and I think Portland also kind of in general has we err on the side of caution when it comes down to politics and things like that, and I think that comic book creators are often writing about heroes who err on the side of caution for people. And so I think that there's a like if you want to make movies or whatever, like Portland's probably not the best place, although I think we could have a great movie scene here, but we don't. We have an okay one. We've got a pretty good theater scene here, but it's not like Minneapolis or Chicago or anything like that. But we've got this really robust comic book community. So like, if you want to be a storyteller and you live in Portland, why not participate in it?
We're good to know. So the next time I have a project that I need to just like buckle in and focus on, rent an Airbnb in Portland because all I'm gonna have to do is just stay inside and work anyways. It sounds like.
I see Greg Rucka walking around the neighborhood all the time.
Oh, that's cool.
Everybody in Portland sees Brian Michael Bendis ride his bike.
Oh, wow,
It's
that's
like,
cool. It's like
yeah,
a thing.
everybody in Portland. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Everybody sees him on his bike. So
All right, Drew. The other interesting thing about Battle Quest comics to me is the fact that you guys specifically kind of promote and create comics suitable for young adults, like YA titles. I guess how does that? I guess why is that important? And then how does that impact, if any, like the creative process for you, especially like as a writer yourself?
um so for me it's like um I create the kind of comics that I wanted to see when I was a kid. I think that you know there is a I think young people can read comic books to learn lessons about how to be better adults. Do you know what I mean? Like I think that comic books you could arguably their purpose is to teach children how to be adults. And Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and the X-Men and Spider-Man and these characters, they make these decisions at the crossroads to kind of try to heal the world and set things right. And then you'll have someone like Magneto or the bad guys, right? And they do the opposite of that, and kids kind of get it. Do you know what I mean? And I think a lot of kids can read a comic book and learn when as I reach the crossroads in my life, I want to do what Batman would do. I want to do what Superman would do. And the kid gets to be a certain age, and most of them will put the stories down and move on. But some of them will hold on to the stories, right? They'll hold on to them forever, like me.
Yeah, present
So
company included. Yeah.
yeah, present company clue, right? Like me. So from and I also think that that's been really helpful with us in the direct market is that the store owners know where to tell their customers if parents bring their kids in, go check out a Battle Quest comic. And like I see all the time when I'm at a trade show, like kids will look up and just see the art and they want to know what that is. They want to know who that robot is. They want to know who this guy with the moonlight axe, like who are these people he's battling. They want to open the comics and collect them and flip through them. And so it was important to me that we didn't have like a ton of R-rated, X-rated content and things like that. It was basically PG, but like 80s PG. 80s PG, which was pretty intense stuff anyway. So
For sure. 80s PG is the equivalent of like light rated R now. Well,
yeah,
maybe not. Rated R might be giving it a little too much, but at least PG 13 and up. Yeah.
yeah, but
A- And,
it's
and to chime into what you said too about, learning morality. through comics. I think, as someone that grew up reading comics since, middle school and especially like high school, I can confidently say like, those early, Spider-Man comics I read, Batman comics, whatever it may be. Those definitely had an impact on my morality, my views of the world, and being able to like put myself in another person's shoes. Obviously, as I grew up and as I started reading, maybe more adult comic books, and I still think to this day it maybe it doesn't teach me the same level of morality. I think I've got my own experiences now to rely on, but I think comic books still to this day, if the story is really good, even as an adult, it might make you question or see a different perspective or see the gray area, or it's always interesting to see how a comic book can tackle like a complex issue or situation. But to your point, I think it is comic books are a great vehicle to teach, the very basic like right and wrongs, to a young kid.
Yeah, yeah, and they have evolved, right? They have evolved, and they've become they, there's almost like these comics, they're like super comics. Like they're just so good. Especially a lot of the things that Image Comics comes up with. Like you hear that Image has got, you know, a huge chunk of the market share of the top 5, and then you read their comics and you learn why. You're like, you read some of these Image comics and you're like, how did they do that?
Yeah, I
Right?
think
And
it.
I make yeah, and I'm like, who came up with this, and how did they execute this on the page so well?
I think it helps that Image doesn't like there's no in-house like Image team there, what I'm like, compared to Marvel or DC. There's like the in-house editorial, they've got a brand, they've got parent companies. uh I think it helps that Image is, for the most part, I think it's probably safe to say like more of a distribution arm than say like a publisher. I mean, obviously they help people publish their comics and get it out, but there's like not one singular voice. It's not like a homogenous, a brand of comics versus like say Marvel or DC. So you get like a lot of different, perspectives and stories from writers, because it's like, yeah, well, if your comic's good, like we'll help you distribute it. We're not gonna, mess with the editorial and try to bend you to like some sort of narrative or mission that we've got.
So I will say this much about that because I've never worked with Image, but I know that Image is the one publisher who says, let's not worry about what we could do to make a movie out of this. Let's not worry what
Hmm.
we could
Hmm.
do to build a friend. What can we do to make this comic the coolest comic it can possibly be? And how can we help this comic book creator make the coolest comic they possibly can? So I don't know, when I hear that Image doesn't do the editorial, they just kind of stamp their logo on. I sometimes wonder about that because I'm not there, but like I sometimes wonder. I know that they have a mission statement to make sure that the if you're a comic creator and they want to carry your comic, they really offer what they
Sure.
can to help make it the comic. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've heard both sides of that fence. They're very hands off versus like, hey, they're an extremely great resource in terms of like fine tuning the story and things like that. Um, Darn, I was on a good train of thought. Oh, I know where to go from there. Staying on the topic of like YA and targeting like young readers, I do find that interesting, considering one of the common gripes, is that the word I'm thinking for? But yeah, one of the common things that I hear a lot of in terms of like the success of the comic book industry, and why it might not be achieving like the success it could be achieving, is that there seems to be an oversight in terms of targeting like young readers, getting like young adults and even younger kids like into comic shops. And that's something that I try to be very conscious of when I go to the shop myself. I can count on one hand how many times I've seen anyone below the age of 13 in said shop. And I guess, is that sort of, would you say that's kind of a would you say that is a mission for Battle Quest, is to get more young readers in there? I guess, like, is that something that you're conscious of as the publisher and putting out your books?
I think as far as kids going into stores, it depends which store we're talking about. I think younger kids in general, are being deprived of good, strong, archetypal moral stories in our society, and whether it's in the comic book sphere or not. A lot of kids these days are being given phones, and they're just kind of even at a very young age, just to watch their kids' cartoons to keep them from crying. You know, I have taken I'm fortunate enough to go into schools and talk about Battle Quest to students, to young kids, and I'm seeing a lot of young kids who will, how they respond to the Battle Quest brand is pretty incredible. And there is absolutely an absence of being able to easily access and tap into that consumer base, to be sure. And I don't mean to speak of kids as consumers, but
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that really is a huge challenge. um, i think I think a lot of that for us would be to get into the book market and get into libraries and
yeah,
have librarians be our champions and have librarians hand our comics off to kids, because all over the United States, in a lot of I'm in Portland, but in a lot of the smaller communities, the library is where a lot of young kids go to find community. They might not have a comic book store in that town. They go to the library. Um, but yeah, I think that there is a real challenge here because the movies have been so successful and so many of them are so good, but I think that there is maybe just a little bit of like waning away from some of that classic archetypal like right and wrong for kids that we're talking about. And that's interesting though, because the enter Battle Quest comics to be someone who can respond to that.
yeah, for
You
sure.
know what I mean? Yeah, yeah. So it's yeah, but I think when we talk about not getting to reach kids with story, I think that expands beyond the comic book domain, right? I think that's actually a big problem in society in general.
For sure. That
What
is
stories
definitely
do we tell? What stories do we tell our children, and how do they access those stories?
oh, well said. And you brought up, libraries being kind of a hub for not only community, but also, librarians being a champion for comic culture and, helping, spread the word. And that resonates really closely with me because my local library, the Jacksonville Library, they throw one of my favorite annual events, the DCAS event, Duval Comic and Zine Fest, where they invite indie comic publishers, zine makers from all over Northeast Florida, and I'm telling you, like the turnout is great. And I will say, I see more younger, parents bringing their kids there, younger, teens hanging out there. So there's definitely something to your point that I've personally seen anecdotally, personally and anecdotally about the library serving as a means of like getting comic books out and getting them, a community of other readers too.
Well, and I would also add to that Scholastic has tapped into that market so
Mm,
excellent,
big
right?
time.
Like
Big time.
Scholastic has got the through the success of Harry Potter and all of the other comic books that they put,
Catman, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
Captain Underpants, yeah, for sure.
Captain Underpants. However, um, comic books, even Battle Quest comics, are one of those things that get kids to put their phones down.
Hmm,
Like there's a
that's a
lot
big
of kids that will,
accomplishment right there.
yeah,
Because I've got a couple
the,
of
the
nephews.
kids,
It's hard as hell to get them to put the screen down.
they will put Bluey down to read the comic book for a while.
Have you ever
Not
thought
anything wrong
about?
with Bluey, but yeah.
Have you ever thought about having that as your tagline? Battle Quest Comics. Your kid will put Bluey down. That's a hell of a statement right there. Because I know
Well,
some Bluey diehards.
yeah. I mean, I don't think I can throw shade at Bluey because Bluey. Did you know Bluey is like the largest growing, I think, entertainment anything anywhere right now.
Wow.
At
Well,
least, at
I
least
mean, I'm not surprised, but I didn't know that it was a entertainment company.
yeah. Well, no. I just mean the entertainment as far as a
Got
show
it.
or
Got it. Okay.
whatever. Not
Okay.
as like Bluey is like something like the largest growing of the top five.
Wow.
We get access to consumer spending data as a publisher because we
Oh,
get to
that's
go
cool.
to publisher conferences and we get to learn about consumer
Hmm.
spending and what that teaches us about what's on the minds of people who are
Yeah.
buying stuff. And um, on that note, like fantasy is the largest growing
Hmm.
genre. Well, when other genres are not selling as well, fantasy right now is doing really well, led by Rom Fan, which is a romance fantasy, like Lore Olympus and things like that. So you do have a lot of teenagers that are flocking to get good Rom Fan, but with that, fantasy in general is a growing genre in sales nationally. And it's spearheaded by what they call the joy economy, which is that consumers are spending money on things that take their mind off of reality. So
Interesting.
you're seeing like yeah, you're seeing a huge decrease in people watching the news. You're seeing a decrease in people buying nonfiction. Um, uh, but people are spending money on experiences like cliff diving in Nicaragua or something like that, right? Like just take
Yeah,
their
yeah,
mind off of something, right? Just go have fun.
yeah.
And so that shows that people are actually depressed at what they're seeing, and they want to go and experience something. And yeah, I don't know how that got around to Bluey, but that's what the consumer spending report
Yeah,
is teaching us about where we are as a people when it
man.
comes to sales.
Yeah, the answer lies in Bluey. Wow. I cannot wait to share this episode with my buddy. That's all about Bluey at this point. But you know what? Speaking about fantasy, and you know, we've brought up and kind of hinted at some of the titles that some of the Battle Quest comics and titles. Um, Drew, I want to play kind of a name recognition game for you. I had the opportunity to read the Battle Quest sampler and get a quick little taste of every single flagship title that you guys had. I was reading through I started the Nomad, not the Unconquerable, but the Young Nomads trade. And I had a chance to flip through the 27 run Crash series, which is probably my favorite out of everything I read. Just because I'm a huge kind of like mech guy. If I see some mechs, I'm like, yo, I'm sold. And the art by Russ Brown in that is stupendous. So I'm gonna name a couple of the titles, the Battle Quest comic titles, and I just want to get your thoughts. What comes to mind? You know, who is this title for? Feel free to describe it as best as you want. So I'm gonna start off with what seems to be like, you know, what seems to be the flagship title for Battle Quest Comics, which is Nomad the Unconquerable. You do the story along with art by Aaron McConnell. What comes to mind?
Yeah. Do you mean what are comparables, or just what comes to mind when I think about
Yeah,
that
describe it.
story?
Yeah, describe it. Who's the story for? You know, like what can you say about it?
I think that was the comic that I was working on just to teach myself how to get into like story development at a higher level. That is an 80s inspired, like if you bought a lot of He-Man toys as a kid, you'll understand Nomad the Unconquerable. It's kind of like a serious He-Man, if you will, where like Nomad is a bit like Ned Stark in the sense that he's a father and he's kind of honorable to a fault to an extent. But Nomad is very much a man's got to do what a man's got to do, and Nomad has set out to set this world right. And along the way, he is going to he fights aliens, he fights gods, he fights robots, he fights ant creatures. He battles giant demonic aliens from outer space that have been created by god planets and thing. I mean, no. I say with Nomad, like all I need to do is just have someone got to throw a kitchen sink at him because he fights everything else. But deep inside, Nomad is really a story about love and like heroism and family,
Okay.
and so it's I feel like if you looked at it, who is Nomad for? Like, I just think Nomad's for everybody, everybody and anybody who likes fantasy or action or adventure. Like, Nomad is for you. Nomad is your guy.
Love it. That's a great sell right there. Okay, let me go down the list. Another flagship title for Battle Quest is the Trident of Aurelia. Hopefully, I'm saying that right. But
Yeah.
it's by writer Lee Moyer and artist Melissa Spandry. I will say this: I didn't get a chance to go through the trade for this one or anything, but I did read the solicitation, and it probably was the most. It piqued my interest the most because of just how interesting the hook was. What is the hook, and how would you describe this one?
Uh, this one is it's mermaid warriors that protect their city from invaders. And it's very much it's kind of a reverse tale of Atlantis, if you will, where like Atlantis is very much the search for knowledge of our ancestors to solve the problems of today. And this is more about, hey, what if you found the knowledge of Atlantis, but it actually you discovered what was contributing to what our ancestors knew actually is part of the reason why society is decaying today. And I think it's just kind of a story that explores that question. But it's
Well
it's it's
said.
it's a cool story, and Melissa Spandry, uh, she she will, I think, man, she's an incredible illustrator. She's an incredible illustrator. And
Yeah,
Lee Moyer is a bit of a Neil. I shouldn't say that one, but he comes from like a time when there was a certain type of fantasy story that was told,
mhm.
and so he's an amazing fantasy. He's an amazing fantasy storyteller, and he had that project like in an envelope because he pitched it to Wizard World. And when it came time to create Battle Quest, he had this whole world where there was like mermaid citadels that like they were filled with ocean water, but they would pop up over the top of the ocean, and the mermaids could come up in the citadel like and look around like they could look around in the top of their towers outside of the ocean and go back down. He had all of these cool ideas for this mermaid universe. He
Wow.
had the gods, he had the realms, he had the heroes and the villains, and so this was an opportunity for him to create that world. And it actually is one of our best selling titles.
Yeah, look, I'm flipping through some of the preview art, and I gotta say, Battle Quest is not short on incredible illustrators. The art in this is just like you said, Melissa Spandry. I would not be surprised if she becomes a household name in the next couple of years. No, it looks awesome.
Yeah,
Um,
that's cool. Yeah.
all right, what are some words that come to mind for Steel Siege, which you're the writer of this particular comic with artist Eric Vargas and Russell Brown?
Right. So Steel Siege is a soldier and a diplomat who work together to fight for peace. And I think that that is, of all the Battle Quest comics, that's the one that's got the most social commentary in it. So you got these two characters, and they get put in these situations where there are these conflicts, and the conflicts mirror what's happening on Earth, right? And so the two characters encounter these diametric opposite worldviews and in violent opposition with one another. And they are us, they are the audience like learning about this, and they can either choose one of these two diametric opposite views, or they can alternately come up with a third view and try to solve the problem that way. And so I saw Steel Siege as a universe where we could explore a lot of the problems that we're going through in the world today, um, in a way that sometimes there's a situation that seems like it's just black or white, but it's a shade of gray. But even within shades of gray, there's black and white, right? So those characters go into these very difficult situations where these groups of people are really angry at one another. I mean, violently killing one another, and they try to make peace. And to do that, they have to sometimes make some hard decisions. And so I think it was our opportunity to kind of take some of the events in the news that we're reading about that are so horrible to read about and learn about, and package them in a way that we can maybe become better problem solvers, and especially for young people to become better problem solvers when they see these types of situations.
That's great. All right, and then last but not least, I want to hear your thoughts on the 27 run, which, like I said, is the one that I had a chance to really dive
Yeah.
into. I mean, art is amazing. It really gives me, as a fan of movies like Pacific Rim, Tomorrow War, Edge of Tomorrow, etc. Like, it definitely scratches that itch for like big mechs fighting like big, scary, awesome, kaiju's and monsters.
Yeah, so Justin, who's also our media director, he wrote that one. And um he did a screening at the Hollywood movie theater in Portland of Pacific Rim, and it was timed out with the release of 27 Run Crash
Oh,
number
smart.
one. So that is a mech versus monsters universe. And so we had like 500 copies of the comic book laid out on tables outside of in the lobby of the theater. And I mean, like, so many people bought tickets to that. It was a packed movie theater. So many people came. They picked up the comic book. Everybody watched the movie. Justin gave a speech. And everyone walked out of that theater so jazzed, because that's actually a way better movie than I remember.
Oh yeah. Wait, Pacific Rim.
Yeah. It's
Oh
a
no,
way.
that movie is, I remember watching that in theater when it came out, and I was like blown away. That movie was fire.
Yeah, cancel the apocalypse, right? So
Yeah.
the 27 run is, I think there's a guy, and he's lost his eyesight, and he has an AI companion. And the AI companion is sort of guiding him in his mech while he's got to battle these 27 monsters that are attacking. And if you like giant mech versus monster stories, 27 Run Crash is a perfect comic for you. Plus, it's funny. Like it's funny. It's a very witty
Yeah.
story, and we're building more in the 27 Run universe. I know Justin's working with Sid Van Blue, who did Transformers for IDW. She's going to be drawing some of the later comics, and I've seen some of that art, and it looks really cool. And I just to pull that back, we work with illustrators all. I've got about 35 illustrators all over the world at any given moment, drawing or writing or working on Battle Quest. Yeah,
That
we've
might be
got
one of
we've
the most that might be one of the most badass ways of saying it. I've got 37 illustrators around the world at any moment. They're just waiting for the phone and the special phone Battle Quest phone in the back to go off.
yeah, or their PayPal account to just ping them. Yeah.
I like it. I like
Yeah.
Drew. What you said earlier about Battle Quest, kind of the name says it all. Even if like you don't know it's a a publishing company and you guys have got a comic, the name really does say it all. And even though we're talking about stories about mermaid warriors or mechs and kaijus and monsters, etc. That name Battle Quest, I think perfect. Like they still fit underneath that umbrella. And the way you described it, like, yeah, I don't see how any fan of like sci-fi or fantasy wouldn't want to check this out, especially considering, to your point, the illustration. We're talking about comics, a very visual medium. The art is so fantastic, and I think you guys deliver on the vibe that comes with the name of Battle Quest.
Well, we had to do that. That's what gets you into Dungeons and Dragons, right? You go by and you see, somebody battling a dragon on the cover of a beautiful looking book, and they're in a dungeon somewhere, and there's a wizard in the corner, right? And there's
Yeah.
like a dwarf with a and some maiden with like spells and glowing spells coming out of her hands, and you're like, what is that? Like, I really. And so Dungeons and Dragons, and I think fantasy in general has to use above industry standard art to get us into it, because
Mm-hmm.
it's fantasy, right? Like, it's every fantasy book in the bookstore has got like a really like beautiful painted cover. They all do. It's also one of the downsides of that industry, though, which is like, well, you gotta invest a little heavily to
You
like
got to
get
deliver.
your
You got
finish.
to deliver on the inside. I totally agree. I hate getting cover swapped. Right? You're like, oh my god, this cover is amazing. And you look interior, it's like that's not the same artist. But you also brought back some memories of flipping through like some of my dad's like old comics, from the 80s, maybe even the 70s, but particularly the 80s. And how many times I would flip to the way back, and it's like at the time I didn't know, what Dungeons and Dragons was, or I wasn't that familiar, but just being completely like in awe of like the badass like ad for a Dungeons and Dragon game, and I'm thinking it's like a video game or another comic book. But yeah, I mean, even back then, it worked on me to see a badass red dragon fighting some sort of wizard in a corner and stuff.
Well, sure, and there's symbolism there's archetypal things that as a young kid we're sort of tapping into, like the dragon in particular in the Western world is greed, and it's hoarding. And so you as a little kid you see the hero with the sword fighting the dragon, and you just kind of intuitively get that dragon is up to no good, and there's this little thing inside of us that's resisting. Do you know what I mean? We understand it. We understand it without fully getting why we
Yeah, yeah,
understand it.
yeah.
And you know what I mean? And so
It's
I
something
kind
almost
of
like
think that with,
primal. Those symbolisms.
yeah, it's primal. And humans, as you know, right? Like what helped humans evolve from all the other hominid species was we communicated in symbol.
Hmm.
Our
That's
ability to communicate in symbol is mission critical to our survival. It's arguably the most significant aspect of why we've survived up until this point. Although it's actually out as to whether we're a successful species or not. Like, let's get back to us in a million years. But yeah,
yeah. Well, I mean, we created Bluey, so I'd say we're
we
pretty
created Chloe.
doing pretty
Yeah, we
well.
created Chloe, right? Yeah, and yeah.
Drew, I want to know what is your earliest memory of comic books? Like, can you remember like your first conscious exposure that like made you a fan? And then I guess I also want to know, to add to that, like, how did you channel that fandom and that energy into like wanting to do this full time?
So I think first of all, first thing with superheroes was going to be the superhero cartoon from the '70s, Super Friends. because that would be on TV, right? There'd be He-Man and Super Friends and things
Hmm.
like that. So Super Friends was the first time I saw a Batman or a Superman or a Wonder Woman. The first time I really saw comic books is going to be at the rack at, like, a grocery store, and they're not there anymore. But you'd go to the grocery store and there'd be a rack of comic books, and as a little kid, you're like, "Ooh, I want to go see what these little cool adventure books are." And I'd get so bummed if my mom or my dad wouldn't let me get one. I actually have, like, I've got real vivid memories of the covers of some of the old comics that I saw as a kid that my parents wouldn't let me buy. And it was like you could get one, but you already got one this month or whatever. Do you know what I mean? You can't go back and get. Uh,
Well, I
and
was fortunate enough to where my dad was a huge comic fan, so I mean he was
uh,
already buying, like he was buying them and sneaking them to the house, so mom wouldn't see. But like, what are some of the comics that like come to mind? Like what you said, you have vivid memories of some of these covers. Like I'm assuming like Marvel, DC, or
yeah, I remember there was a West Coast Avengers cover I really wanted to get, and somebody was like throwing Tigra in the air, and I was like, oh, I just really, I think
poor
it's West Coast
Tiger.
Avengers 9. Yeah, poor Tigra. I think
Yeah,
it's West Coast. As an adult, I realized that was West Coast Avengers number 9. But
nice.
I also really vividly remember the first day I went into a store and that rack was gone. That rack was gone and it never returned. And I remember, like, I rushed in the store. Yeah, little did I know it was all designed to get me into the comic book store and out of the supermarket chains to buy comic books. But the comics that I liked as a kid were, Spider-Man, X-Men, Batman. I really liked Batman. I liked the early Ninja Turtles comics a lot.
Okay. And then I guess like what was the catalyst to go from fan to writer and publisher?
Yeah, so uh sounds weird, but my mom was a manager of a children's theater. So I grew up like kind of immersed in story as a kid, and I wanted to work in story professionally one way or the other, and it just so happened to be that the comic book community in Portland was really big, and comics were really big here. So I thought, well, let's just get into making comic books. Of course, I had no idea how to make a comic book. I didn't know the difference between a JPEG and a TIFF. I didn't
Hey,
know. I didn't know.
Drew, look,
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
plenty, as someone that works in marketing and in corporate America, there's plenty of adults to this day that don't know the difference between those two things.
Right, right. Yeah, no. So it was just like slowly learning how to
Hmm.
to make a story as a comic book, then how to illustrate it, then how to edit it, then how to letter it, how to color it, how to print it, how to sell it. And that was, I mean, that's probably like a 9-year process from 2011 to 2020, right? And then in 2020, I think I'd been doing Comic Cons for about 7 years, so I knew how hard it was to sell comic books, but I could also see the state of the market and what the market was missing, and the market was missing that kind of just traditional sense of adventure. You know what I mean? That was inherent when I was younger, and a lot of that was just because of the economic changes and the movies and generational change, right? All of these things were happening at once. So I said, okay, there's an avenue for us to enter the market, and so I took that, and it just so happened to be that because some of the bigger publishers had left Diamond, Diamond had room for Battle Quest.
Okay. I guess
Yeah, I don't know.
well, hearing you say like 9 years of just like hitting the ground floor, learning the every single nuance and facet of creating a comic book. This might be a silly question, but why comics? Like why do you think why is comic books the perfect medium to get these stories out? Because that is something I am getting from you. Drew, we've only met for like an hour, but it is very apparent that storytelling and the power of communication through stories is very important. Like why is comic books the perfect medium
I mean,
or the preferred
comic.
medium?
Yeah, so I think some of that is the types of stories that I like to tell, and the budgets that it would require for those types of stories to become like a successful moving image. A lot of it was really just biogeographical. I just happened to be in Portland, and I wasn't in Los Angeles. I wasn't in New York City. I'd lived in both of those cities for a short period of time, but I didn't have access to the type of story teams that you would need to launch film and television. I've since gained access to those types of people, but I think it was kind of like, if you want to work in story, you will find a way to work in story, right? If you really want to, you'll find a way. And so that was just how I think I found a way. But I also love comic books. Just so happens to be, I love fantasy. I love comics. I loved collecting action figures as a kid, right? I loved 80s cartoons. I loved going home from school and there was like some cool stuff on TV to watch, right? I loved Twilight Zone. I love Star Trek. I loved those great 70s movies that were before my time. I'm not that old, but those real gritty, like sci-fi movies of the 70s and things. So yeah, it was an energy that fascinated me, and I think I wanted to understand it better.
Well said. No, I mean, perfect reason. Who are some of your, I guess, like inspirations or North Stars, whether it be like other comic writers or maybe like someone on the, business side of comics, another publisher, like who helps, excuse me, who helps guide or inspire you like creatively?
Well, I definitely loved Marvel in the Jim Shooter era. And I loved the early Valiant comics that I loved Magnus Robot Fighter. Like I got a chance to meet Jim Shooter and tell him how much I liked Magnus Robot Fighter, and like he just smiled.
Oh, that's great.
I liked the Jim Shooter rule about how all the characters had to repeat what their powers were. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
he had to act as if the hero had the reader had picked it up for the first time. I actually thought that was really smart.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, 100%.
So
He
from
basically
a
took
business angle,
yeah, he basically took like I think that was like one of Stan Lee's like initial like creeds and rules early on was like it should always be someone's first, always keep in mind this might be someone's first comic. I think Jim Shooter's rule only like built on top of that.
but yeah, that's why Rogue a million times over was like, "I'll touch you and take your powers in your psyche." She
Yeah.
says it like all the time. But I that era is kind of what I grew up in. So that sort of stuff was really inspirational to me. As far as like, I really loved what Marvel did with the Ultimates universe. The way that it revived it. I mean, I loved Mark Millar's run on Ultimates. Like, I loved that issue where they were fighting the aliens, and it was like Ultimates number 12 or something. It's like 52 pages or whatever, and Quicksilver is just running around, just beating the crud out of all these aliens, and he comes to a stop, and he's like resting, and someone says something to him about Quicksilver, like, "You're not doing anything," or "Go faster," or something. There's just this one little panel. Quicksilver's like looking up. He's like, "Did you not just see what I did?"
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I like good story and good storytelling wherever I can find it. So
Hmm. All right.
I
Oh, good.
um I had a chance to work with Tom Orzechowski, who the letter of the Uncanny X-Men. He was the first, like, of the classic run of the X-Men, the Claremont run. He was the first, like I'll say, like, OG. He was like the first, like, real old school creator that ever came in to like lend a hand to me, and he was lettering comics that I wrote. It would be like he was working on Todd McFarlane, Grant Morrison, and Drew Kafoury comics, right? Like, go figure that one out. But he said something to me that was real interesting. He talked about how, because I loved that classic run on the X-Men, and he was talking about um like how Shadowcat and Aurora had this mother-daughter relationship, and how much that meant to him writing or working on those comics. You know what I mean? And I hadn't thought about it, but I was like, you know what, Tom? I liked that too. That
Yeah.
really was interesting. There really was like the mother to the daughter, and it wasn't, it was about growth and maturation and love, and I hadn't thought
There's
about that before.
No, that's a great perspective. I mean, that is one thing I do remember. I don't remember every detail from the Claremont X-Men run. I do remember like absolutely being enthralled by it as a young teen finding those issues. But the thing that stands out still about those stories is like the humanity and the characters, the character work and stories of like and just how different every single X-Men was, like Yeah, there was something very warm. The way Storm is kind of like portrayed, like whether it be in the Claremont X-Men or even like something like X-Men '97. There's something very regal and warm, and just something very motherly about Storm. I think that's why she's one of my favorite characters.
Do you know what Tom said about Wolverine? Well,
Hit it.
obviously, I mean, but he said something. He said Wolverine was an animal who wanted to be human, and that's why the samurai was so important to Wolverine, because
Oh,
it balanced the feral side
yeah, yeah.
with humanity. And that's why, like, when his relationship with the woman in Japan he was going to marry went south in the comics, it just broke him. You know,
Damn, yeah,
yeah.
something about like having that honor and him putting that honor on such a high pedestal. It's interesting because I actually just I read on the topic of Wolverine. I read Weapon X for the first time. The Barry Windsor Smith like classic. I don't know if Claire Claremont wrote any of that. I think it was just Barry Windsor Smith did the art and the story. But reading it for the first time, at this age, it just hit a little different, man. Just like, once again, like, I feel like humanity, I've said it so many times, but there's something very just heartbreaking about reading that and seeing like the last bit of humanity that Logan was holding on to, like completely stripped from him to become like this killing machine. Now you got me wanting to reread a bunch of X-Men things.
Well, and I love that. I like the Barry Windsor Smith one where it's like, I think it's X-Men 208 or 207 or something. It's where Wolverine fights Lady Deathstroke in the snow.
Oh, that is a good one. Actually, I think it's in this collection that I'm reading. Yeah.
It, it,
Damn.
it should be
Okay.
in the back. Yeah, yeah. It's kind of like the epilogue to all of that. But man, that's
Mm-hmm.
that's
Well said.
that's a bitchin' comic.
Damn right, a bitchin' comic. All right, Drew, I want to hear from you as we get to wrapping up here. I do want to ask this though. As a publisher, as an independent publisher, as a writer, someone that's been working, in the difficult industry that is comic books for the last 10 years, what is, and this might be a multi-part question, so yeah, I guess if you could change one thing about the comic and book industry based on your experience, like, and if you like, let's say you were given like a magic wand or the Infinity Gauntlet, you could change one thing about the comic book industry. What would that be? And then maybe if it's related or at the same time, what is something that I guess like a fan underestimates when it comes to being in the industry or and being a publisher? Like, what can you share about that?
I would love to see more cohesion between the movies and directing consumers to retail. That would be one thing I'd like to see change. So DC Comics, a couple years back, they had four movies that were supposed to come out: the Batman, Aquaman. I think Batgirl was still supposed to come out at that time, and then there was a fourth. And they maybe canceled one of those movies, or they split them up into several years. But they had this really great marketing campaign where when the movie came out, there was going to be a rack in stores that would be only content based on what that movie was, and it was going to be pretty much free of charge from DC. They were going to provide the rack. They were going to give store. So if Batman, Matt Reeves' Batman came out, there was going to be a rack filled with Batman comic books in the store. And so that, like, directing consumers to the store to get tie-ins to the movies, I would have loved to have seen that have been something that I don't know if it's possible to do that given how all of this works, but that's something I would like to see. I would like to see more of, like, what you see on the moving image be linked to, making it cool to go into the comic book store to buy what's there. Do you know? I would like
Yeah,
to see.
and I think I recall that. I remember the Matt Reeves being really impressed by the rollout and the marketing for the Matt Reeves Batman, because they were like directly saying, "Hey, this movie is inspired by what was it, like Long Halloween? I think like Batman Year One." Like they were specifically, calling out what stories were. I didn't know about the setting up a little display. That would be really cool, especially if it was free of charge. Like
Well,
comic
yeah.
shops are working on a yeah. Um,
Then
but I think
they
we're seeing
canceled.
that with
They Sorry, but they canceled two of those movies, so that rack only came
yeah,
twice instead of times a year. And if it had come
got it,
four
got it,
times a
got it.
year, that would,
I think
yeah.
No, no, I agreed. I think more would have been better. I think we are seeing some of that with James Gunn at the helm of DC Studios, and specifically like the Superman movie that's coming out, but primarily the Supergirl movie, because that is a direct a direct correlation to Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow. Sorry, Tom King's Superwoman of Tomorrow story. So it's a little easier to like guide someone to like, hey, this is what the movie is based on. I think something like the Matt Reeves Batman, you're working with multiple elements, which is something that I've always thought about in terms of like where that where that disconnect is that it's hard to point someone to there's almost sometimes not a lot of one correlations, where it's like this Marvel movie combines multiple elements, so it's hard for me to like suggest to you, like I've got to suggest to you like three comics and explain to you that they're picking elements from this and that. But to your point, I think DC does a really good job of like encouraging that a movie fan pipeline to go check out the comic book or getting them in comic shops.
DC, doesn't have the Disney money behind them. So that might be one reason
Yeah.
why DC is a little
Hmm.
bit better at that
Yeah, that's fair.
particular marketing component. You know what I mean? They might see the value in that. I've actually always been very impressed with when I see DC Comics present at the Comics Pro forums, like what their annual lineup is, and trying to tie the movies and the TV shows into getting consumers into comic book stores. The next question I think you asked is, what is something people don't know?
Yeah, like what is as a regular, Wednesday warrior. I go into the shop every week. I'm picking up comic books. This is like kind of like all I know. Like, I guess how can your regular Joe Schmo? Not, I won't even call him Joe Schmo. Wednesday warrior is a way cooler name than Joe Schmo. How can your regular Wednesday warrior, I guess, what can they do to support? We talked about like kind of like the rising tides raises all ships mentality of, like having bigger publishers, and it's not, everyone doesn't need to be selling a million copies. Like there's some publishers that need to sell this many, and this is their size. I guess what can Wednesday Warriors do to support and make sure that there is a diverse and healthy ecosystem of comics, especially with like indie publishers, especially during like these trying times? I guess is the easy answer just support, buy the books? Is there more?
I think we need to give them what they need to support the books, as opposed to them needing to do it. So we need to create content that they find engaging, and then we need to let them know how they can get it, and that becomes the first hurdle of comic book publishing, is that our first buyer is the store owner, and the store owner is supposed to take a risk on us, and the store owner is supposed to direct the consumer to us. And once we've built a foundation in stores, then it's much easier for us to do that consumer outreach, right? Like that's so consumer outreach from an indie press is more of a long-term strategy, because it's super hard to get a consumer to go in and purchase like the now what they could do if they wanted to just be like an awesome person is, yeah, like buy 2 3 independent comic books a month. But it really is our job to build compelling content that makes them want to support us. So that's what I try to do at Battle Quest Comics, and that's why I try to build a strong foundation of story. Do you know what I mean? So I can earn that with our readers, so they know when they pick one of our comic books up, they're in good hands with us, and they're not just spending their money to keep us alive, but we're actually providing an important commodity in their life.
That is well said. And I think with that being said, Andrew, I will address the listeners. Ladies and gents, this is the Short Box Podcast, and we just finished talking to Andrew Kafoury about running the company that is Battle Quest Comics. Be sure to check out some of the company's flagship titles like Nomad the Unconquerable, Steel Siege, the 27 Run, and so many more. I'll have links in the show notes to the Battle Quest Comics website where you can take a look at all of their flagship titles. I'll also link to Andrew. I don't know if you're on social media, but I'll try to at least link to something for you so people can give you a follow. I think you're a very smart guy. You got a very sharp head on you and a great perspective and view on comics. Do you have any parting words or anything that you want to plug before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would just say to anyone listening to this, on social media, you're gonna like just there's a ton of negativity on social media about the comic book industry, and I'm not gonna sit here and say that there aren't a lot of people who've been burned by the comic book industry. However, at the core of the industry are good people working on stories to try to help other people. Really, truly, that's what's really going on there. And the sales in comic book stores, there is data that is showing that comic book stores are one of the few brick and mortar shops that uh, you know are actually doing very well in society today. So when you read about doom and gloom and comic books dying and stores going under, I am certainly not saying there aren't people impacted by that. There's a lot of stores out there that have, $3 million in profit every year too. And a lot of it is driven by the sales of new number ones from publishers like Image Comics, Marvel Comics, DC Comics, and hopefully one day those sales will be driven by Battle Quest Comics too. Yeah,
Damn right. I
there's a
love
lot
it.
of optimism out there. Yeah.
No, I love it. I love ending on optimism. This was great. Andrew, you are fantastic, man.
Thanks. Let me come back on the show sometime in a few, in a little while. We got more to share.